Okay, can you see it?
Yeah. Done. So we are on YouTube. Carla, do you see the link above? Live, where you see the red live icon?
Yes, I can see it. I will post it now. Okay.
You can, yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Pablo and I were going to switch on the microphone now. And if you need us, just let us know, okay? Joana and Joana?
We got another 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
So we start exactly at 2. And Joanna has around 50 minutes talking and 10 minutes for questions.
That sounds good.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. Thanks.
Joman,
yeah.
Can I just ask you one thing? So,
right.
Remind people that they need to raise their hand if they want to talk.
Yeah.
And that they also have the Q&A button to ask questions in the end.
Right. Right. So yeah.
Because people may want to talk in the end and they don't. They are not familiar with the webinar. Okay.
So preferably, I would say that people can ask questions with a microphone. But if for any reason their mic doesn't work or whatever, there's the option for the Q&A.
Yeah.
So people should check that make sure that they find these buttons on their Zoom interface.
So that's the 2 options, right? The preferred option is microphone, otherwise Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And they can chat among themselves. That's up to attendees.
Okay. Dear friends and colleagues listening from across the world, welcome to the first keynote speech at the ECIR 2020. My name is Gonçalves, and I am one of the PC chairs for the ECIR 2020 program. Before I introduce our guest speaker this afternoon, let me remind you two things. So the speaker will be talking for 15 minutes, and there will be opportunity to ask questions at the end. What you need to do is, you need to press the raise your hand option at the bottom screen you will see on the Zoom windows. And then we will enable your microphone to ask the question. And if any reason you cannot use the microphone, you have the option to use the Q&A. That's again another question and answer button at the bottom screen of the Zoom windows. Okay? Now, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker, Professor Joana Gonçalves. She's an associate professor at the Nova School of Business and Economics. She's a physicist by training and did a PhD in systems biology from the University of Harvard. She is the leader of the Data Science and Policy Research Group at University of Lisbon and coordinator of the Science for Society initiative and as the director of Graduate Science Program for Development, aiming at improving science in Africa. Her current research uses data analytics and machine learning heavily to study complex problems at the interface between biomedicine, computation, policy, social sciences, and mathematics. This encompasses areas like epidemiology, critical thinking, network dynamics, political discourse, and their application to human behavior, with a large ethical and societal focus. She's also the recipient of an ERC starting grant in 2019 on human behavior using the online spread of faking news as a model system. We couldn't have a better speaker given the COVID-19 pandemic and also all sort of fake news associated with them. So over to you, Joana, and we are all waiting eagerly to your great talk. You will talk for 15 minutes, and I will remind that there will be 10 minutes questions available for people, right?
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction, and thank you everyone who's out there listening to the talk and following it ECIR2020 online. And the talk that I planned for today, I changed a little bit the scope of the talk that I had planned for today because of the pandemic. And so it's going to be on a particular type of research that we can do. And I'm going to try to focus on the risks of doing it. So I understand most of you are experts on retrieval and are experts on how do we get data and to play with data and extract information that is useful from the data. And I'll try to play the devil's advocate a little bit on the risks of doing what we do with the data. So the general argument is that we are living the fourth digital revolution. We have a first industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution. We have the first one starting in the late 1800s with a mechanical loom. And then we moved into having assembly lines, and then to having computers program those assembly lines. And now we are living in the fourth industrial revolution, the one that allows us to have digital information, digital data, and work with it. Now, all of these revolutions are fundamental, and we have moved immensely as a society, and we can do things as a society that we could not do before. And I'm thinking about things such as from transportation to electricity in our homes. But of course, no revolutions come without a cost. And we have moved, for a very long period of time, we have suffered also the consequences of the industrial revolution. Especially in the beginning, we had I'm going to call them the dark ages of the industrial revolution, where we had almost no limits for instance, child labor. And the children were expected to work on factories and to work on the coal mines. And it took 70 years for the first actual legal limits in the UK for child labor. And even if we look at those, and some attempts have been done before, but these were the first ones that had something, that they had some sort of a punitive side and inspectors. So it took the 70 years for us to start having legislation, and even this legislation had a limit for child labor of 9-year-olds. So only 9-year-olds could work at factories or in the coal mines, and 13 to 18-year-olds were not expected to work more than 12 hours a day. So even when we started having limitations, they were still pretty terrible, and it took us 200 years to actually have international legislation on child labor and labor legislation in general in 1970. And we are still suffering from other consequences. So we can argue that many of the negative consequences of child labor, that they were pretty much eliminated in Europe and parts of the Western world, and in some parts they were just exported to different countries, and they still exist. And of course, we're all battling pollution and other issues. So there are always downsides to revolutions, and the digital revolution that we're living is not going to be an exception. There are good things and there are bad things, and I'm going to be trying to talk about both in the context of the current pandemic and the context of health. So we've heard of many scandals, from Cambridge Analytica to how we can be manipulated, to how our data and our privacy can be exploited by big companies or states. And we, of course, are living through an epidemic of fake news. And this really builds on the fact that we are somehow predictable and that we have human biases that can be exploited for the profit or for many different interests. As we said in the beginning, my research group, we have a large project on studying fake news, and we already have publications now regarding the current pandemic, or at least some pieces on this. But today I'm going to try to focus on health and how can we use the tools that we have to study health, and how are we being exploited in a completely different way, or do we have the potential of being exploited in a completely different way from the Industrial Revolution, but still because we have liabilities, we have fragilities that can be used against ourselves. Okay? So the general idea is that together with from machine learning, big data, all the different tools that we have now, we have created a macroscope. So physicists have a telescope and biologists have a microscope, and it's as if now social scientists and computational social scientists have a macroscope, a tool that allows us to study human behavior in a quantitative way. It's at individual level, but it's large scale as well. And we can really understand individual behavior patterns and networks. But we are not looking at cells, we're looking at people. People are not necessarily aware that they are being seen, and our actions influence people. So people are being manipulated as well. We created this macroscope, which is an amazing tool for us to understand dynamics, for us to understand human behavior, but it's also a dangerous tool. And we have to learn how to focus it, how to use it. So today, I'm going to be talking about a little bit about what we've been learning from research from both my research group and others, starting with the flu and the flu pandemic, and what we can learn about behavior in a context of a pandemic and the anxiety that it brings. And then I'm going to try to give a couple of examples of what is being done in the current pandemic and the risks and the different balances between, oh, this is excellent, we can understand a lot about human behavior, and we can learn, and we can help, we can be much better at controlling the current pandemic, but without the risks of losing oneself in it. So lessons from the flu. So the flu is a much simpler problem than the one that we're facing now, and I'll argue that it's still a very complicated problem. So we know that the flu is coming every year. In Northern Hemisphere, it happens in the Northern Hemisphere winter. It happens between October and May, more or less. And every year we know we're going to have seasonal flu, but we don't know exactly when it's going to start, and we don't know exactly how hard it's going to hit us. So how many cases and how serious it's going to be. And we've been studying flu for a really, really long time, and we've had mechanisms to track it for decades, and still we do not know with any type of accuracy or very little accuracy when it's going to start or how bad it's going to be every year. So what you are looking at is for two countries, European countries, one very much in the south, which is Portugal, and one very much in the north, which is Norway, and every line corresponds to a flu season. So from 2010, 2011 until 14, 15, it's been the same. So what you can see is that the peaks vary. The intensity of the peaks vary. So some seasons, like this green one, it was not very intense. There were not a lot of cases, which does not mean that the mortality was lower. It just means that less people were infected or reported infected. And some seasons, there were a lot of cases, which again might even be a milder season in terms of symptoms or disease, but there were a lot more reported cases. And sometimes they start right in the middle of the flu season, let's say November, sometimes even late October, and sometimes they only start in February, March, and we never know. And what happens is that we have systems that are planned to identify when the flu season starts and give alerts. And what I'm going to show you now is when typically these alerts are given. So these are the official alerts from the official agencies, in this case from Portugal and Norway, saying that the peak has started. And what you can see is that very often these alerts are given either at the peak or sometimes even past it. So, and it's very similar for normal. So sometimes they are given really at the peak. Sometimes the peaks are not very strong. Sometimes they are given even for, after the peak. So by then, all medical doctors in all hospitals already know that the flu season is here because all hospitals are crowded. So many people have tried to model these diseases, and because they have a very similar profile, like they go up and then go down, and everyone is now sick and tired of looking at these sort of curves. But we have simple models that we can use. This is the most simple model that we use in epidemiology. It's called an ECIR model because it divides the population into the ones who are susceptible. In the current pandemic, pretty much everyone is susceptible. So the assumption is that we have the entire population here, 100%. And then with a certain rate, the susceptibles can become infectious and infected. And then with a certain rate, they can recover. The most basic model does not include, for instance, disease. The people will die. It does not include facts like latency. So you might be infectious without having symptoms, and this can delay, or it can change the probability, your rate of the contact rate. And then we have a relatively simple set of equations that we can solve, and we get these sorts of dynamics. And these dynamics that we get, typically you have this exponential growth phase where the number of cases are increasing, and then you peak, and then it goes back down. And these are the curves that we've been looking at. And this has been done for the flu for quite some time. And so how do we know how many people are infected or infectious? Flu is arguably the system in the world that has the best data. So the way it works is that we have all over Europe and in many different countries, United States is similar, we have what we call sentinel doctors. So these are doctors from the primary care typically, and they see patients that have or describe flu symptoms. They list these flu symptoms. They also take some swabs for laboratory analysis. And then they centralize all of this information first nationally, and then in the case of Europe, the European Center for Disease Control, United States, CDC, and then when people start seeing the curves appearing, and then there is some alert, so flu season. Okay, so again, this is seasonal influenza, and we know that it's coming, and we know the symptoms, and people are already expecting the flu, but it's still quite a difficult problem. So the CDC, the American Center for Disease Control, in 2016, started a competition encouraging the general community to use different types of tools instead of just relying on the current alert system with the medical doctors taking the swabs and describing symptoms, which is a solid system, very slow in the sense that typically, if everything goes perfectly fine, we have at least 2 weeks before people start describing the symptoms and going to the doctor, and the centralized data saying we might have a problem. But typically, it's much longer than 2 weeks. But if everything goes fast, we have a 2-week delay in reporting. So the idea is, can we use other data sets? Can we use different data sets online, other types of data sets to predict the flu? Okay? So this was the group that from ECIR2020 that won this competition back in 2016. And what you have, they have a website that's still existing. This is an old shot print screen of the slide of what I did before. And this was the town that I used to live in near Boston, in Massachusetts, in Somerville, and that's I was curious to look at it. And basically what you're seeing here is that the orange line is the actual number of cases and the peak when it happened. And then the blue line is weekly prediction. So every week they will have a prediction for what the peak would look like, and they would plot it. And then the following week, and then the following week, and then the following week. So by no means, I mean, I want to argue that my colleagues were not doing a good job. They were doing the best job that anyone was doing at the time. This is just to illustrate how difficult of a problem this is, even for seasonal influenza, for the ones that we know. The symptoms every week, it was a poor prediction. Okay, so many people started thinking about how can we use these different types of data sets. And one obvious was, so if people go to the medical doctor and they describe symptoms, okay, now we increasingly so, before people going to the medical doctor and describe their symptoms, they ask Dr. Google. So people go on Google and they Google their symptoms, or they Google something else, and they will put all of this, and Google will have all of this information about the symptoms that people are Googling or things that people care about. So Google try to predict the number of the flu, and the concept is very simple. As more and more people are getting sick, and we see our curve increasing in terms of the number of cases, maybe more and more people are also Googling for their symptoms, so we can see a similar curve in terms of the variability on Google changes. So Google created a system called Google Flu Trends. This was a paper in 2009, and right before the flu pandemic. This paper compared a number of searches on Google with the number of cases. So in blue, it's the Google estimates, and then in orange are the number of United States cases that they had. And you can see that overall, there is a good correspondence between the number of cases and the algorithm, Google's algorithm. This algorithm was proprietary, so people didn't really know what were the terms that were good predictors of the flu. And it ended up failing twice in a relatively short period of time. So the first one was during 2009 pandemic, which was somewhat expected because it was a completely different circumstance. It was not the seasonal flu anymore. And then later in 2013, and a series of papers came out talking about big data hubris and how Google got it wrong. And the general idea was that there was overfitting. So Google was using, have all this possibility, this wide possibility of terms. And one of the things apparently that was a good match, or that was a good predictor, was college basketball, just because the season, the college basketball season tended to be more or less during the flu season. And but the idea was that there was overfitting, and the obvious reasoning that people search on Google for many different reasons, and not just because they're sick. You can go and search on Google because you're afraid, because you're curious, because you are you're anxious maybe, and especially during a pandemic, you might make a lot of different searches that are not necessarily related with the fact that you are sick. So you can clearly overestimate the peak and the number of cases. Okay. And the way Google did this, they did it using a simple regression. It was not a very fancy system. And because these are Google trends for searches for machine learning from 2004 until today. And we really didn't start thinking and talking about machine learning until 2016, 2017. And this paper from Google was here in 2009. So it was, at this point, there was all of the data, and big data was already something that people were talking about, but the tools that they were using were still quite different. So Miguel Juan was a postdoc in my group at the time in 2016, more or less, here, started thinking that maybe we can do this, and we can split this problem into two different problems. So one problem is, can we predict the peak, okay, and figure out how bad it's going to be? The other problem, which is a simpler problem that we wanted to focus on, is can we now cast the curve? So when it has started, when do we have an inflection point here, and we have very few cases, and then it starts going up. So can we say when it has started, which is informative for hospitals to prepare, and can we say, and disentangle it from, can we predict the peak? So if we go back, if I go back to this example here, here one of the problem is has it started? The one is it going to be very bad? And we were focusing on just, can we understand in real time or very fast that the peak has started? This is what Miguel set up to do in 2016, and we started with our susceptible infectious recovery model, but with a trick. So instead of using a constant contact rate, so that this likelihood of you becoming sick, instead of using a constant one, Miguel used a signal function. So and the idea of the signal function is that if we can fit a sigmoid and we can understand the inflection point of our curve, we can understand where T0 is, where our time zero is. And the time zero was defined as being halfway through this inflection point. The number of cases starts going up, and then when we can tell, okay, it started. And of course, this is never this nice, it's very noisy, so it becomes the problem is a little bit more complicated, but the idea is, can we understand, can we nowcast, not forecast, but can we tell in real time it has started, the epidemic. Okay? So this is what we did. So we changed slightly changed the equation to have a different data that we could fit, and we did it for, at the time, 8 different European countries. So we have different seasons, flu seasons. This is what you're seeing here, and then here we will use our contact rate to try to see if we could have a sigmoid in the place where the peak has started. Belgium, I'm showing here, and the answer was yes, we could use this trick to say when T0 was with pretty good accuracy in terms of the flu has started, and sometimes would have like on average around 7 weeks between the beginning and the peak, but peaks were different. Some of them had a little bit longer, sometimes they were flatter, sometimes they were not, but in general, we had this system. Okay, so now the question was, can we do this in real time, and can we use these different data sets that do not rely or do not depend on the slow medical reporting? And we tried several different things. One of them, of course, Google Trends, so searches on Google for the different terms, and a system that was unique to Portugal at the time, and now it has spread. Now it exists in the UK, it exists in the US, Canada, New Zealand as well, which was a phone line for medical diagnosis. People would call with their symptoms, they would describe their symptoms to trained nurses, and the nurses would follow an algorithm, follow through the questions. They will go through an algorithm that then will determine whether people would stay home or if people would go to the hospital, for instance, not only for the flu, but for many different symptoms and diseases. Okay. So then we use this, we trained our machine learning algorithm to try to identify the features that were the best predictors of our curve. So of our T0, we did it in real time, and this was, again, we did it for the 8 different countries, and overall, we managed to anticipate the alerts by an average of 6 weeks at the time. So a month and a half before when we said the onset has started, and the official alert, which are these red lines over here. So what you're looking at is the orange line is when we say it has started, and then the blue line is our predictions that were better in some countries than in others. So when they are very close, they will be better than in other cases. In case of, let's say, Spain, Italy, even Portugal, the accuracy was less than a week typically. Okay, so what we had done there at the time was to try to split a complex problem into a smaller pieces that were a bit easier, and have a simple model that could now cast the outbreak. So we really don't do any sort of prediction, or we avoid doing any sort of prediction in the group. What we try to do is to give accurate information as much as possible. At the time, we're working with authorities to offer these weekly reports and predict with the Ministry of Health whether or not these things were happening. We were recently asked by New Zealand, which is like the opposite, the antipode from Portugal, to do this in real time as well. So we hope to be able to test this system now in different countries. And again, we are now casting, not forecasting, and to help in data-driven policy. And this system is easy to adapt to other diseases, and we can change the data sets that we use to feed our model here. And we've been adding things such as weather, Twitter, and other sources, data sources. Okay? So what about pandemics? Maybe this works for seasonal influenza, like Google was doing a good job for some time. But what about when things get a lot crazier, like now? So now this plot shows the number of cases for the flu in the United States, and this is the solid line. This is a reported number of cases in 2009. So this is during the 2009 flu pandemic. And then the dashed line is the actual number of cases, and the solid line are the normalized searches on Google for flu. So what is very obvious is that people were searching for flu in April, May a lot. This is when it peaks, but the number of cases was not very high. And then when the number of cases was actually very high, the number of searches on Google was much lower. And this is a type of problem that Google Flu Trends were struggling with, of what type of terms are good predictors. And flu clearly is not a good one. So Claudio, who was a student in the group, started thinking about whether we could distinguish between the different drivers of online behavior, the different reasons for why is it that people are searching online for different things. And what role does the fear or anxiety or concern is playing in this online behavior when we're doing searches online? And again, and also if we can use these tools to understand unrest and compliance in terms of pandemic. What Claudio started to do is to create two data sets. One on searches on one that we call the online data sets, so online information that we can cover. And this includes searches on Google, Wikipedia, Twitter posts, the things that we could come up with. and then an offline data set that we could compare it. And this would include a number of full cases, media reports. And here I'm going to show you the example of the United States. We did it for several countries, but here I'm going to show you the example of the United States. We're using New York Times as a proxy for media reports. And then we took advantage of the fact that there were many, many surveys happening at the time, asking people about compliance and fear and risk perception that we used to compare as an offline data set. So we have our pandemic period. We divided into the pre-pandemic period. That included a little bit of the seasonal influenza. And then we have the pandemic period from the moment that the WHO said that there was a pandemic and the number of cases started to appear, to the post-pandemic period where the flu season was already seasonal. The flu cases were already seasonal. It was an H1N1 strain at that time, but it was during the normal flu season time. So do these searches or do these profiles, do this online and offline behavior have different profiles? What Claudio did was that he collected, I think he was showing 50 different possible terms that you could search on Google. And these include symptoms such as fever or cough or vaccines, and they can also include number of famous medication at the time. I think I have here zanamivir, oseltamivir, masks, precautions, many different things. Okay? And he extracted the time series for all these different searches on Google. This is more or less how they look like. And then use hierarchical clustering to group them. And you can see, because it's already color-coded, that we have two broad clusters. So one cluster, this cluster over here, basically only has one peak. So it was an early peak, very nice and pretty early peak. And then there's a second cluster, which is much noisier, and people can or might not have this initial peak, but typically has a second peak later on, and it's easy to see how we could break this into other subclusters. So Claudio started with these two clusters, and what we're looking at is the centroid of the two clusters. So this is the centroid of this cluster here, and the bottom cluster here. And if you can see the shading, you'll see that one again is much noisier than the other. This one basically has no variance at all. So, and then Claudio plotted the number of infections. So this is the number of infections and the number of news. In this case, because it's United States, we're using the New York Times. And he correlated them. And what he saw was that one of the clusters correlated very well with the number of infections, but not with the news. And the other one correlated very strongly with the news, but not necessarily with the number of infections. So there were some search terms that were that have a shape that was similar to the shape that we found in case when infections appeared, and one that was pretty much only when we had the news media. So the hypothesis here was that people were searching differently if they were sick, or if they had sick people around them, or versus if they were just curious and because they were following the trend of the news. So to look better into this, Claudio and Luisa Franco, which was a postdoc or an independent researcher, Claudio and her looked at around 60 surveys in 9 Northern Hemisphere countries from April 2009, so when the pandemic started, to January 2010, and looked for questions such as how anxious, how worried, how concerned are you regarding the possibility of you or someone from your family contracting the flu, versus how likely do you think you are, how susceptible you think you are to actually contracting the flu, getting sick, becoming sick. Okay? We had to normalize the metrics. There was a lot of work here, and this is the other study that I told you is already peer-reviewed, but this one is not, so it's still ongoing work. But what they saw, Claudio and Luisa, was that this is the same thing that we're looking at. So we were looking at the centroids, the search volume, only now it's truncated in April because it's when we start having the survey data. And now, and these are the series, the time series that they came up with for the risk perception and for the anxiety. So these were from the survey. People are saying that their risk perception varied like this, and then their anxiety level varied like this. And when they correlated, they saw that the cluster 1, which was the one that was much more correlated with the number of cases, was also much more correlated with individual risk perception or close family risk perception, whereas the cluster 2, which was correlated with the news, was now very correlated with anxiety, but not necessarily with risk perception during this period. And when Claudio used only the terms that we identified as being better at risk perception and better at correlating with the actual number of cases, he could run a similar model to the one that I was describing before and predict the seasonal influenza now. So not pandemic, but are these terms better at identifying seasonal influenza or not? And when you looked at just the terms from cluster 1, they were much better than using the top terms from both cluster 1 and cluster 2. The one was more correlated with them. So the overall take-home message from this part is that, of course, your online information seeking can have different underlying reasons. And in this context, we can distinguish between potential motivations. So it's as if some terms people were using because they were more anxious or more afraid, and some because they were actually sick or had people around them that were sick. And this has implications not only for disease tracking, but for human behavior as well. Okay, so now the question was, are these lessons valid now? Can we use what we've learned from the flu and the types of work that we've been doing not only for seasonal diseases, but also for the pandemic, to apply to the current pandemic? So everything that I'm gonna show you now is not peer reviewed, and I'm gonna show you some ongoing work both from ourselves and from other groups. And I ask you to take all of this with a grain of salt. This is a lot of food for thought that I find important to do at this point and And then, so the current pandemic, okay, so the current pandemic, it was the virus, or the Chinese officials notified the WHO about a weird disease on the last day of 2019. And then on January 11th, China recorded its first death. And the information that we have, so this was a paper that was published in February regarding the Wuhan outbreak in one of the top journals. And the median age of the patients was around 47. So it was already, the idea was that we're beginning to understand that it affected more people that were older than younger, contrary to the 2001 to 2009 flu pandemic, where both very young and very old people were more affected. And then the symptoms were not very clear. So 50% had fever on admission, and then a higher number had cough, and fewer had some sort of nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. And we're still debating on the symptoms. So unlike the flu, where the symptoms are very clear and it's fast onset of fever and typically some sort of other respiratory consequence, here it's not so clear. And then things have been moving very fast, and this is the current timeline. So from the December 31st, when China warned that they had a weird virus going on, until now there are 2 million confirmed cases. So on April 13th, there were already a lot more. So but on April 10th, we have 1.7 almost million confirmed cases and 100,000 deaths. Now it's getting very close to 200,000. And it was very, very fast. So the outbreak in Italy began on February 21st and on March 31st. So 3 months after it was warned, more than 1/3 of the humanity was under some form of lockdown. And this is why we're all doing this online today. And 95% now of all Americans, for instance. And how do we know that people are in lockdown and that they are following the lockdown? We are using things such as cell phone data. This is the work from the ISI Foundation in Italy, and they were already tracking the flu. So they already were part of a large surveillance system in Europe called InfluenzaNet, where people do self-reporting on the systems. One of the things that they had was an app, a voluntary app that you download into your cell phone, and that it gives some information. You can answer also some surveys. It gives the information to the researchers, and one of the information that you provide is your location. So what you can see is from early February until end of March, the darker the color, the less the movement. So what you see is that in the beginning, people were moving around more or less generally. And then some regions in Italy, this is for northern Italy, some regions in Italy, really you start seeing a lot of dark blue and they start moving. And this date here, so March 8th, is when the national lockdown went into place. And you basically see a little bit still in the beginning, and then as the time goes by, pretty much there's almost no movement in all of Italy, and the lockdown is actually working. And there are these areas where we basically don't see anything. This is in Milan area. So Google, using data typically from cell phones as well, from location on Android, has been publishing reports. Now has reports for pretty much all countries in the world. And this is for within countries, sometimes per region. In this case, I'm showing you for New York, but you can follow the link if you want to see the reports on location data for the entire world. And they compare on different areas. So it's a little bit more fine-grained than the data that I was showing you before. Now it's really, people are going much less to retail and recreation. They are going much less to their workplaces or transit stations, and they are staying more at home, residential, when compared to the baseline. So, and now it gets even more fine-grained. So now this data, the GLEAN project, is from, it's led by Pignani in the United States, but it also includes groups from Italy and elsewhere. And now we're looking at individual level data as well, like I was also looking at individual, but now we have, for instance, movements, and then this group also has information on individual households. So people who live there, if they are older, if they are younger, if they have children, if they go to school, and very, very fine-grained information. Movement across airports and flights, and they have they've been doing this not just for the COVID. They've been doing this for a really long time for many diseases. They have did it for Zika and dengue and of course the flu, and they have a lot of very, very detailed information at individual and household level, and then they make their predictions using very complex models of how all of this information is interacting. And their models are a little bit more, at this point, they already include the latent, and they have done this for Wuhan, for the Wuhan province in China, and made very specific predictions for what was going to happen, what was happening, and also the effects of the lockdown and the mitigation. Okay, so these are some of the ongoing efforts. Of course, Sara Mesquita was a student in the lab with Lydia, who was a senior researcher. They've been applying some of the same methods that we have for the flu now to the current pandemic. So she's also collecting, and she has collected our online data sources and the offline data sources as well. If you care to take the time, we are also running a survey to look at the type of issues that I was describing before, anxiety and others before, so that we can create our offline database. And we're taking it slow, but you can also see this is for Italy, but we're doing for Germany, and US, and Portugal. You can also see that it's very similar in the sense that we can identify clusters of such terms that you would not have identified previously, so they are not obvious. And some of them that correlate more with the actual number of cases. And now this is for New York. For Italy, we're also doing it for breaking into every region, and of course comparing with the media and comparing with the other data sets. This is for Twitter, very, very recent study as well. Very similar approach, using different centroids use different words or terms on Twitter, and how is it that they are varying over time. And you can see that there are at least two clusters. So one of them, the blue line and the orange line, again, one is a better predictor of the number of cases than another. In this case, the other one is much better predictor. Okay. So all of the movement has been into really creating large data sets and creating very fine-grained, almost individual level information of behavior, of movements, of searches on Google, of Twitter posts that really help us understand how the pandemic is spreading, if people are taking the measures that health authorities have asked for or not, and how fast it's spreading and how much this is working. All of the measures that have been implemented, particularly the lockdown. But there's also information, there was also information already in use for COVID because of people who skipped the lockdown and went on social media and bragged about it. So they said, oh, I wasn't supposed to be flying from China, this was in the early stages, but I just arrived in Paris, and these people were the authorities were warned about some people posting personal information on social networks and saying that they had skipped the quarantine and they had consequences. So they were identified by the authorities and put back in quarantine. And of course, because like we're saying, people when they're feeling sick and they go on Google, on Dr. Google, they ask for many other things, just not just their symptoms, right? They ask for sometimes their deepest fears. And this is Google's autocomplete for when you type in 3 different languages, just for fun, of if you type "why am I so," and some of the top Google is offering you to complete the sentence based on what is more common in general for people to ask. Okay? So this was done in an incognito window, but you will see that people will ask things like, why am I so thirsty or angry or sad? And then people ask how to kiss or how to tie a tie. And some of them, in Portuguese, there's a lot of like, how do I kiss? Or how can I be friends with someone? Or in French, you can also see, why am I always sad? Or why am I always alone? And these are very personal questions. The idea here is that people ask Google things that they might not ask their best friends, or they might not ask their parents, they might not ask their doctors, they might not ask their psychologists. This is really a window into people's fears and to people's concerns. And again, it comes with a big responsibility to know all of this about people. So I'll show you a very similar thing to when we were doing the anxiety project, and we were understanding that people had these searches there were because they were sick or possibly sick or because there was disease around them, and they had these searches because they were afraid. So we can actually do it the other way around and see what are the terms, what are the things that people search for when they are afraid or when they are anxious. This is what I'm going to show you now. So these are people who put on social media at a certain point that they were depressed. So this is day 0. On day 0, they went on social media and said, I've had a diagnosis of depression today. And then you can look at their social media up to a year before and a year after and see if there were changes in profile of different things that you can do. In this case, what the blue ones are the ones who had a diagnosis of depression, and the green ones are the ones who did not have a diagnosis of depression. And the lines start being separate, statistically separate, more or less 3 months, like 100 days, more or less 3 months before the diagnosis of depression. In some, there are several papers now doing this, but some of the predicting factors, some of the features in the algorithm are things such as you change your pattern. So you used to be someone who used to be diurnal and you become nocturnal. Or some things are you're typing differently on your keyboard, stronger or harder, or you're making more mistakes. They are not necessarily medical symptoms. Some people will put photos of their medicine online or the drugs online or the things that they are taking, but some of the things are much more subtle and they're not even considered health data. So they are not necessarily protected by things such as the GDPR because they are just patterns. They are not, and of course this can be very useful for the individual, so that you can anticipate that maybe I'm going down a slippery slope and I should find help. But this could also be very useful information, for instance, for insurance companies who can raise the premiums here even before the person has any, or when the person starts having any signal, but is far from diagnosis, still a couple of months before, because they know this person is going to be more expensive. Or even for an employer deciding whether or not to promote someone, or deciding to promote one person or another, depending on what, and they identify that one actually has a high risk of depression, and they are most likely going to promote the other person and probably even create a negative feedback loop in which the one who did not get promoted will probably even become more depressed. So these are all information that we can extract from the behavior, and we can extract, especially the moment we get it much more fine-grained, that we should worry about or that we should decide whether or not we should be doing this. Okay? So we have to balance things, especially now in this circumstance of the pandemic. So it's important to have this individual level information because it's fundamental for disease monitoring, or might not be fundamental, but it's definitely going to make things faster. and we are learning a lot about human behavior, and we're turning social sciences into quantitative sciences a very fast rate, but also has all of these different problems in terms of privacy and control, and what happens if this information falls in the wrong hands, and the type of society that we want to have. Now, because of the pandemic, we are talking about things such as the immunity passport, in which people who can prove to be immune will be able to return to work and go back to work. And of course, this can not only, it creates constitutional issues in many countries, because you're giving more rights to some people than to other people, but you might also be actually giving incentives for people to go out and become sick, because then they will be the first ones back on the job market if they can prove to be immune. So just to finalize, I'll go back to this idea of the macroscope that we have built that allows us really to track people in a completely different way. And the risks of the digital revolution that are not small, and pretty much every time that we have crises, we typically lose rights, we lose fundamental rights. And one of the rights that we are more at risk of losing now is the right for privacy. And many people will tell me that it's a good risk, or it's worth it, because it's the type of trade-off that we need. I'm willing to give off my location, I'm willing to give off all of this information to the state, or whether or not I'm immune, or the people who I've contacted with, and my close contacts, because it's important to stop the pandemic. And of course, these are excellent arguments. The point is not that we shouldn't do it. The problem is that we need a very broad societal discussion on whether or not we want to have this sort of tracking, not necessarily just for the pandemic, but in general. And I'll close with a controversial sentence, hoping that I'll get some questions about it, because it's the type of work that we're doing now, really about human behavior and the fear of tracking, which is when we become all too vulnerable to something that they told us over and over again. Okay, and what we've been told is that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. When the fact is that if you have nothing to hide, then you are nothing. Because everything that you are, the place inside you, your inner resources from which you draw your sense of identity, your sense of voice, your sense of autonomy and moral judgment, your ability to think critically, to resist, even to evolve, these are capabilities that can only be grown within. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Joana. Dear friends, we have some time for questions. David has raised. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Bottom you can see. Bottom you can see a raise hand option. Please raise your hand. And alternatively, you can use Q&A option as well. We are watching that. Okay. So Sergio, please hand over the mic to Sergio, please. Sergio, you need to unmute. Your mic is muted. Some time for questions. David has raised. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Bottom you can see. Alternatively, you can use Q&A option as well. We are watching that. Okay. So Sergio going to ask a question. Sergio Nunes. No, Sergio, are you there? You raise your hand. Right. Okay. So let's go to the next question. Mr. Turkey asked, do you use ontologies or topic modeling to link between a disease and its related concerns?
Sorry, I can't really hear you now.
Okay. Let me repeat it. Do you use ontologies or topic modeling to link between a disease and its related concerns? This question is given by Mr. Turkey.
Okay, so probably this question is about when we are, question is about the searches, the Google searches, and the clusters. Would that be it?
I
You
can't.
know.
I can't get the questionnaire online. It's an offline question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So the one that I was showing you there, we tried many different methods when we. Let me go back. So it's not very obvious what is the best way, as you probably know, what is the best way for us to identify either groups of questions or the clusters of questions. So we tried many different systems in the beginning to figure out which one was giving us more accurate and solid clusters. And we actually just redid most of this work now because of the current pandemic, and we've settled for the simplest possible process. So what we are doing is it's very simple normalization, and we are doing very simple Euclidean distance between the time series, and we just minimize those. I don't know if this was exactly what you were asking.
Is Mr. Turkey online?
And then we did hierarchical clustering, and we used words to see. So
okay.
In the beginning, we tried many different things with different frequencies, and now this is the most simple thing that we can come up with, and it's working quite well.
Thank you, Joanna, and quite a lot of applause for your talk on the chat session, etc. All right. Let me ask you a question, right? So we are talking quite a lot about privacy, etc. recently, and now given the scale of pandemic, right, many of these privacy concerns are in the back burner, right? What effect do you see on society if we continue to progress towards this line? Surely we need to deal with pandemic, okay? And in that case, given that a lot of people losing life, privacy may not be a big concern. But if we continue and set in systems, what social effect do you foresee once this is over?
Yes. So I think this is I understand again. This is a difficult balance, right? So it's not necessarily just the lives, because I think that if we can decide as a worldwide community to enter lockdown, as seems to be happening, we will eventually contain. The problem is that we need to go back to work, because we're going to have a bigger problem if we have a collapse of the economy. And a bad economy is really bad for one's health. So it's really not something that we can decide between health or economy, because we know that recessions are terrible for the health. So what we need is so this is a difficult balance. What we are doing is we're gaining time, and one way of we're trying to gain time either for a vaccine or for a cure or for some sort of herd immunity, if herd immunity is possible, because it's still the jury is still out on that one, on whether or not people who are infected are completely immune or recovered, become then completely immune. But we are gaining time, and we can have the urge to really go back to work as soon as possible. And Germany is discussing this possibility of having a piece of paper that tells you that you are allowed to go back to work, or if you're not, and other countries are going to start having this discussion very soon. But there are several things that I think we have to do very fast to try not to have to make this decision. So either we move very, very fast in the technical terms. So what we need is, for instance, we need to think about ways that with this information does not get centralized. Can we have distributed computing systems where you can have an algorithm that is working on a general basis, and is really the general algorithm will know the type of information, who's immune and who's not immune, and who's been tested positive and not tested positive. But all of this information never leaves your cell phone, or never leaves your own individual data set, so that it's never centralized and never becomes an issue. Another hypothesis, maybe in the mathematical terms, in terms of herd immunity, we can have enough people that we can sample randomly the ones who are going to go back to work. So it's not because you're immune or not, because we don't want to reward the ones who actually skipped lockdown and quarantine and became infected, and now are going to have an advantage. But maybe we can identify mathematically the number of people we can allow to go back to work as a random process, so that these ones, so that we don't need to know exactly who's immune and who's not. It's just like we have the number is low enough that the contagion rate is low, and the probability is low, and this way you could have people start to go out. Another idea, we could make sure that we focus on the type of jobs so that everyone who's really not required in presence does not go to work. Okay? This would create personal problems to me because I have small children that I have to homeschool, like many others, I think currently around the world, but we need to be creative. So I think that what we must do is really to try to be as creative as possible so that we do not get to the point where we have to decide at individual level who goes back to work, and we do not have to create stamps on people of who's immune and who's not, and who should be doing or should not. This is for the pandemic. Of course, the general question of privacy that was just made more urgent because of the current pandemic is a completely different problem that we really have to think about as a society in general terms, because we can all see the advantages in terms of safety and security and not being, and but we can also hopefully see the disadvantages in terms of limiting to our individual liberty. I think you're muted. I can't hear you. Sorry.
Thank you, Joana. Thank you, Joana, for that great question answer. I have another question. Carlos Gemmel asked. I will read out the question. If you, have you given thought to predicting peaks of reinfection after the first peak? Can we use these same models to mitigate the effects of the lockdown relaxation?
Okay, so I'm going to assume that this is about the current pandemic.
Yeah.
And what we don't know. Okay, so what we don't know, we don't know if there is reinfection first. So typically in terms of infectious disease and viral diseases, right? You can have different levels of whether or not you become completely immune. So you can become completely immune, like you had it once and you're never going to have it again. Or you can have a certain level of immunity that can last for a small period of time, but then you become susceptible again, or you might not really become immune, or the immunity might be very short-lived. So in this case, in this particular virus, we still don't know whether people are becoming immune. But there have been described instances of what looks like reinfection, meaning people who tested negative for the virus tested positive again. This can be for different reasons. It can be because the first test where they tested negative was not properly done, so it was a false negative. It can be because there was no reinfection, but the virus was not completely eliminated, so it was not detected, but it reappeared. So it also happened with the viral disease that you can become sick sometimes years after you had the first infection because it wasn't fully eliminated. Not in coronavirus that I'm aware of, but I'm not an immunologist or a virologist. And then the third hypothesis is that there was actually a reinfection, and we don't know which one is. We still don't know what is happening in this case. So let's assume that yes, and people can be reinfected. What we can go back is to our models, like I was showing you the SIR model, which is the simplest one, but there are models where you add letters, not only SIR, susceptible, infected, recovered, but you can have susceptible, infected, recovered, and susceptible again. So the recovered can become again susceptible, and this way you can model different sinusoids. You can model a series of sinusoids, and you can use the information to remodel to use. And here what you do is that typically the number of people in this, we call them compartmental models because you break people into compartments. You say, oh, you belong to this group, you're the susceptible, you become to this group, you're infected. People can change between compartments, of course. What you do is that you will no longer probably have 100% susceptible. Maybe some of them are going to be immune, so you don't start from your N of 100. You start with something else with a little bit lower percentage. But yes, you can model different cycles, and you can model different possibilities of the infection. And this is what many of my colleagues are doing now, is really creating as complex models as they can, and try to figure out, not necessarily predict what is going to happen, but given what we know, how is it going to look like if we do this or if we do that. So we change the different parameters in the model and simulate what's going to happen.
Okay, thank you, Joana. Thank you for your wonderful and timely talk on your work. And as you can see, there are quite a lot of applause and support for this talk online happening right behind the scene. And this is so we are completing this keynote now, and we will move on to the next session. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joana, and congratulations for the great talk.
Glad you liked it.
Something about the next event? People may be.
So yeah, people can now go to the workshops and the tutorials. They should be restarting now in a few minutes. So